within their relationship linked to that. And the alcohol may be present, but it may be nothing to do with the actual risk of this happening. So we did one study looking at the roles of alcohol. We were interested in how victims maybe coped using alcohol, how perpetrators used alcohol, how non-perpetrators used alcohol, and also the presence or absence of alcohol use and difficult alcohol use within conflictual couples rather than abusive couples. So thinking about the macro system, so we've got cultural values at the highest level. In Scotland, certainly, there's a high tolerance that it's a drinking culture. It's something people do. It's how people relax. It's how people socialise. Not drinking sometimes can be a problem within a Scottish culture. If you wish to go and socialise, then actually not taking the alcoholic drink would see you as odd. But we also have some other beliefs. So these guys are talking. So this is guys within prison talking about their use of alcohol and their conflicts in relationships. The first participant is saying, there's nothing else to do. My girlfriend and I, if we're planning something else, or she's got her wee girl at the weekend and didn't go to the grands, then they wouldn't drink. So this is something I would think about as about exposure of children to alcohol. There are some choices there. But if they're on their own and drinking, or, socialising, that is what they would do. They would drink. That was what it was. And one of the interesting things is they talk about minimum pricing. So it's only £15 for a bottle of vodka, and that would be a good way of socialising. Other things were too expensive. So some of the social, sporting, cultural activities were too expensive. I'm sorry that the bottom is cut off with this one, but another participant is saying it'd be the weekend, we would explode, we'd end up having too much to drink, we'd argue every weekend. So there was a pattern of, as they were doing downtime, they would drink. They would know that it was a risk factor for them to argue because that's what they did, but drinking was part of the culture. At an individual level, I think our participants were brutally honest with themselves and with us in a hilarious way in some ways. So one of the guys in prison was saying to us, I think I'm a genius when I'm drunk. I think I know everything. I can be very patronising. And one of the things of what he has said is that I think moves away from a notion of drunken, intoxicated, problematic drinking just in terms of violence exploding. Is it really taps into this, I can be very patronising. He was really saying that he would have this higher sense of entitlement. He was drunk, he knew everything, people should listen to him. So it was coming back to a notion of control about, my needs and my understandings and what do you know? And there was definitely a hierarchical structure within that. Another young man is saying that it changes him when he's been drinking. He gets hyper. When he's sober, he's a quiet, shy wee boy. He, to an extent, I think, was drinking more as an enabler to engage in social conversations. But again, it gave him this sense of power. He could go and do things he wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The third participant, who basically talks about I've got morals and priorities when I'm sober. When I'm drunk, I'll just have a carry on. And basically he was talking about sexual infidelity, that he, when he was drunk and out with his partner, would go and talk and chat up all sorts of other girls and indeed go home with them. So his entitlement to sexual activity and his actual links to his partner and the care he had for his partner were totally broken down when he was drinking. But he also knew this. It was almost like he was giving himself permission under the influence of alcohol to make choices that he wasn't prepared to face when he was sober. In terms of drinking families, drinking together was seen as a positive in some ways, but there was a sense that it facilitated conversation, which was excellent. But as our participant, the first participant we interviewed in prison says, after a couple of cans, you start to open up more. Or she's had a couple of vodkas and you start talking. I don't know, one thing leads to another, something gets mentioned and it sparks. It triggers it. Now, he just thought that alcohol was the trigger. It triggers it off, and one of us goes in a rant, it gets louder, and it quietens down. And what are we arguing for is what he says. Well, he's been convicted of domestic abuses in prison, so it doesn't quieten down that quickly. It tends to quieten down when the police arrive. His level of abuse was actually quite high, and the level of violence was high. So there is something about, that ongoing minimisation of violence. But he was saying, it's the alcohol. And I would be saying that it's their conflict resolution style and many other things within that relationship facilitated by alcohol, but it was a routine activity. And I think the last point I want to highlight is within the Scottish culture, we have a really interesting gendered view of drinking. So we asked so the participants, this was men and women, but I'm talking about the male participants here, what did they think about women drinking? And actually they had some really strong views that women shouldn't drink in the same way, that drunken women were a problem, that drunken victims were to blame, whilst their excuse for men was that drunken men were less at fault and drunken victims were more at fault. And I would sort of say, if we're highlighting the different ways we think of identities and where we locate the issue, certainly in Scotland, we've located substance misuse as an addictions problem and a problem of an individual. And I would say, well, at a cultural level, at a family level, at an ecosystem level, we really do have an issue, because we have women should be more caring, so they shouldn't drink. They should be more conscious, and especially with all the children. So they're making reference to their status as mothers. And bear in mind what I said, that our data shows that mothers don't drink over the weekend when their children are present. Dads do. I don't like women drinking pints. It doesn't seem right. A lot of them now, it disgusts us, these lassies talking horribly. Lassies is Scots for women, talking horribly. I'm a bit old-fashioned in that way. He did have traditional views in some senses, and he was quite happy to apply them to what he thought of drunken women, which was quite interesting. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move to the next study briefly. And this is a PhD study that I'm supervising. My student works as an advocate and support worker in an area, a specialist service for minority ethnic women who have experienced domestic abuse in Scotland. Often these women have unstable status in terms of their immigration status. Many of the women have come from the Indian subcontinent on spousal visas to marry Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi men within the Scottish culture. These men tend to be first, second, third generation immigrants, but they quite often have their partners come from India or Pakistan or Bangladesh to marry in. And Elaine's PhD has been very much looking at the experiences of these women, how the law can act as a barrier or the law can act as a facilitator, unfortunately most often a barrier, but also things about the actual complexities of their experience, in the sense that it's not just the male adult partner who is perpetrating the abuse, that within the extended family and within a living situation where quite often they're living with mother-in-law, father-in-law, uncles, brothers, etc., there is a tolerance and support for this, and that part of the culture that they import from the Indian subcontinent of izzat and honour serves to keep them actually within an abusive relationship, and also blame themselves for bringing dishonour upon the family. One key thing within this information, and the slides will be available, is that within Scotland, within the UK, arriving on a spousal visa, you have no recourse to public funds until you get your immigration status formalised. Now, it used to be that it was 2 years probationary period to get the right to remain, and they've moved it to 5 years. There is a provision that if you've experienced domestic abuse within that time, you can in fact leave and can access, I think, public funds, but you have to have 2 pieces of evidence to say that this abuse occurred. So there is some notion that the reporting has had to have happened at least twice, and hopefully with a couple of the stories you'll see, that's very difficult, because there are language barriers, there's access to the police, there's a lack of understanding of what being a British citizen means, or what being in Britain means in terms of human rights and access to support. And the women, certainly within this study, often had no knowledge of what they could and couldn't do, and were far more worried and far more persuaded that what their parents-in-law were saying, what their husband was saying, that if you complain, you'll be on the plane back to Pakistan tomorrow, and you can deal with what happens there. So, again, we have the nested ecological model, and things like race, ethnicity, xenophobia, the structures of our system very much impinge on an immigrant experience, and hopefully when you read it through, that will also make some sense. So in terms of the microsystem of the abuses that immigrant women were feeling, you know, they were strangled when he was drunk, physically beaten by mothers-in-law as well as adult partners, physically beaten by the husband, raped and sexually assaulted, and this was an area that wasn't easily defined as being abuse because they were married and there were expectations about what that meant. You know, and some things about, one of the women highlighted that for her, one of the issues was taking her scarf and strangling her with it. that it was almost so denigrating to her in terms of her choice of dress, etc., that there was a real disparaging comment within that. In terms of some of the barriers, often the women would talk about sort of the concept of izat, the honour culture, the not bringing shame on your family or on your community. So even at a cultural, slightly broader level, it wasn't just within the family, there was a barrier to disclosing because they didn't want it to be seen that it was a problem of immigrants, that our culture, it's the violence is within our culture, not broader Scottish society. And to be fair, there are people within the Scottish society, the majority culture, who would quite like to say, oh, it's not a problem for the majority, it's a problem for the minority. It's people like them who have these cultural beliefs about the roles of women, not us. But bear in mind what you've just seen about the alcohol and abuse. I think that's nonsensical. The lack of service and not knowing anything about the country was really, really important. There was a misrepresentation of rights by perpetrators. And in some ways, there was an inappropriate response from some services. A little interesting point is in Scotland, we have a system now that if the police are routinely called to a domestic abuse call, they will remove the perpetrator. They'll take the perpetrator away, and it's understanding of the impact of moving women and children out of house. In migrant women, in the minority ethnic groups, they take the women away still because it's not about just her and her partner, it's the entire family, so they won't rehouse them. So she is then the problem again. So there's an interesting parallel. Again, if you look through the impact in terms of the law, dissuaded, by legal services to actually pursue any justice, lack of evidence, lack of access to services at a number of levels, women from minority ethnic groups are disenfranchised. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop forward and just briefly talk about the parenting study. This was work done with criminal justice social workers in Scotland, and partly because going back to the beginning where we say we know that nothing works or that there's very little impact of traditional programmes, we decided to see if we could pair up domestic abuse programmes and parenting programmes. And this is from knowledge I have that often me as a father, and when I realise that I'm having an impact on my children and I look like my abusive father, that's often a tool, it's a hook. It's when I genuinely start engaging with change. It has been controversial. We decided to give Triple P a positive parenting approach, a strengths-based intervention to men convicted of domestic abuse. There were many issues about managing safety because of the potential use of the children and the potentially privileging knowledge so that mothers would perhaps then be in the position where father says, I've done a programme and I know, and now I know I'm a better parent than you. So we managed that through multi-agency working. What we ended up with was we did a study basically, and we've got a logic model sort of looking at the various different specified outcomes and outputs. And what we have is we've got slow recruitment but good retention. We've got attitudinal changes for the participants who've gone through the programme. We've got a shift in motivation to change. We did have one man further offend, but actually within the group we had that was probably lower than predicted and managed within the services anyway. And one thing that was good is we had enhanced disclosure in terms of risk and safety management. The key things I want to highlight, though, in terms of the impact of skilling people up in a strengths-based way and working with what the fathers wanted, was Mum is now saying, it's a blessing that he went. I couldn't cope. He would tell them to do something, they'd not do it. I'd tell them, they'd say no, we'd have a go at each other, he'd get up, get angry. And obviously, it was a point of conflict. Now, what she's saying is this particular parenting intervention gets fathers to challenge their automatic negative thoughts, their attributions as to bad behaviour in the children. They're doing it on purpose, they're doing it to wind me up. And that is the point we hoped would then maybe translate out to other things. And certainly for this participant, she's saying, we're talking more, he's talking more, he's understanding more, and he's recognising, hang on a minute, that's an automatic thought. And then thinking about what an automatic thought is, recognising it and dismissing it before any damage is done. So these men are starting to challenge their own thinking about their children, and I was delighted to see also about their partners. Okay? So he gets a bit upset. He's quick to anger and shout, but he's applied it. In terms of the dads, they were also saying that they found the programme content very important. The first participant is saying, it's very important for me and other people. Usually I don't bother about other people's points of view, but I don't want people to think he always shouts at the children, he's murder, he's doing this. I don't want to be like that. So he says he doesn't want to be like his father. He doesn't want to be seen as a poor father. It opened my eyes to the way you should be with your children, and the relationship would be about your children and things like that. It made me feel really guilty. I mean, this is something we did have to manage. There was a lot of guilt and shame about actually the realisation that their behaviours would obviously have had an effect on their children. But the fact at this point they were then having the skills and confidence to go and try out more positive parenting interactions with their children, and they were getting positive feedback about it, was very helpful. So one of the fathers said that he refused to think that he was neglecting his children because he'd exposed them to domestic abuse, but actually, having gone through the programme, he could understand it and he'd accepted it and felt he was doing something about it. But that message was quite a difficult one to handle. So there is something about how you handle that information. So the point I want to pull out here is, it was a learning experience for me, definitely. I knew I was at fault with my parenting and lots of it. Drugs use, shouting and bawling in front of the children, insulting the children without realising it. Like when they spill a cup of juice and I'm saying, are you bloody stupid? And it's right away, I'm angry. What this guy goes on to say is, there was a section on automatic thoughts. That to me was like gold. That was something I'd suffered a long time in my life. We make up things we make up in our head and base on. If you're having an argument with your partner and they say something, your automatic thought is that they're accusing you or they're trying to upset you. I'd never heard that before. So one of the things we were hoping is that the challenge of the automatic thoughts in regard to the children's behaviour would translate out, and actually there was some evidence that exactly that was happening, that the men were going away more skilled to kind of reflect on their thoughts and think, there are other ways to do it. Our practitioners loved delivering the programme. They thought that parenting should be a core part of their work, that it was a really valuable programme. They thought it was very, very difficult, though, to add it on to their workloads, and I suspect many of you might be in a similar position. So coming back towards the end, this is the participants, our practitioner participants talking. Positive programme. There were a couple of guys that were really positive. The numbers were an issue, but it was positive. There was a lot of screening involved, so they selected the right people to go onto the programme, and that was very important. They had built up a relationship and knew a lot about the people before they started. There's an issue about respect within the programme, the strengths-based approach, the fact that it was an evening programme, it was a voluntary programme, it was informal, it was about parenting, it wasn't about domestic violence, so it wasn't about directly challenging or shaming individuals, and that was seen as important. There was a concept, we had pizza and food we gave to the participants because they'd come from work and they came and we gave them hot food and some drinks and things, and that was seen as very, very positive. Other people had said, that was collusive, it was, we were handling it incorrectly. But actually, everybody involved in the programme had said the importance of treating the participants who were coming voluntarily to address some issues with respect, facilitating their attendance, thinking about them as people, having had a hard day at work, really, really mattered. It was nighttime. It was showing them respect for coming. I'll move from that. What do we need to think about ultimately? Try and draw it together. And I appreciate I've talked very fast through many, many things. The idea is, though, that we do have challenges at a cultural, institutional, family and individual level. They all interlink, and it is these multiple social identities that make us the people we are, but also need to inform the interventions that need to be provided for us. So the idea is the sort of man, woman, Scottish, British, Asian, Chinese, Hong Kong. Which identities are important for you? How salient are they for you at all points? Which ones need to be addressed? Can you separate them out? Drinker, etc. My favourite model, we come back to an Essed ecological model of interventions. It suggests that what we do need to be doing is challenge at a cultural level, challenge at a systems level, challenge healthcare, welfare, education, and access to those systems. They need to be made culturally sensitive, but they need to be appropriate for people with different social identities. So I suppose one key message I'd want you to take away is that, to me, culture is not necessarily about ethnicity. It is about social identity. And the subculture of substance misuse, drug use, drinking can equally disenfranchise people as a subculture of other in terms of minority ethnic identity. All of these things we have to address, otherwise we're not doing a good job. I think I'm going to stop relatively now, as I'm running out of time, and say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So we have time for questions and questions specifically directed at Professor Gilchrist for her presentation. Anybody? Esther? If you just briefly introduce yourself and ask your question.
All right. My name is Esther Erlings, and I just finished a PhD at one of the other universities in Hong Kong, Chinese University. What I wanted to ask is, you talked about the need for people to work with people with problems, if I can say problems, to really understand these people. And I was wondering to what extent you would find it necessary for these people to sort of belong to the same group, for example, to belong to the same ethnic group, or perhaps if we're talking about substance abuse, somebody who has experienced themselves.
There are two views, I suppose, within current practice within Scotland or within the UK. And certainly in America, there's a predominant culture of putting people in a group for specialists. So you would have Black American groups for domestic abuse. You would have Hispanic groups for domestic abuse. And certainly at one point when I worked in the West Midlands, there was a culture of not putting one individual from any particular culture to be the only person in a group, so that because they would be seen as potentially being demonised within that group. My preferred view is I don't think that you should put all the same people in a group necessarily. I don't think it's required. I do think we need to be doing our work in a culturally sensitive manner. So that is about thinking about people, but protecting people from being demonised. So I wouldn't put one person of sort of deprived identities in a group, because there is a possibility for the rest of the group members to say, well, I'm not as bad as them. And it's a problem there, and focus around issues to do with a culture we don't understand and something like that. But actually, I think mixed groups are really, really helpful, because the problems are shared problems. We have different identities, but actually, for many of the men in the groups I'm talking about, the key problem that we're trying to address within that programme is about the domestic abuse. And the fact it translates out slightly differently if you're a drug user, or if you're a substance misuser, or you're from a minority community, or you have specific cultural beliefs, is just a pathway, but it's not maybe the core issue. I mean, obviously, chaotic drink and drugs users can't necessarily get involved in the programme straight away.
Any other questions? Do you want to press the mic button, please, so that we can get it on the video?
You talked about, it's Polly Radcliffe from King College. You talked about the traditional programme that some of the men had done. I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about what that is, really.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know to what extent people use a psychoeducational kind of Duluth-based intervention, 26 weeks programme here, but certainly in years gone by, I used to deliver a programme, and it was very much based on the Duluth model from the USA. It was based on a concept that domestic abuse arises primarily from patriarchal structures and is a problem of male identity within Western sort of cultures, and that actually by explaining to men within a programme where their cultural identity comes from, by challenging that, by holding them accountable, that we could enact change. Now, sometimes it was possible to do some of that. Some of the issues, and I swear I have done this myself, is that it was quite shaming. It was very, people became quite defensive within the programme. So we would always deliver with 2 women and 1 man in the group. And that was so that there wasn't 1 woman in a group of men being demonised. It was quite difficult to avoid the idea that as a woman you were challenging men, and that, you know, you would say that you're a woman, it's all about men's being problems, or indeed when the concept of power and control, which was one of the core concepts within Duluth, that domestic abuse arises from male entitlement or beliefs of entitlement to be in control and having power and unequal power, many of the men did not feel powerful. And, obviously it may be that they were using abuse to reenact that power because it fitted with cultural beliefs about men should be in power. But because they did come from disadvantaged groups, many of them were from minority ethnic cultures, and often they were drinking, they actually had an experience of being powerless in their relationships as well. They didn't believe themselves to be powerful. There was a huge amount of sexual jealousy and infidelity, and the men were saying that because their partners potentially were more verbally fluent and potentially they felt more attractive, they were having to manage this. So there are elements of power and control within that. But the message is that purely through a psychoeducational group, by exposing people to information, they would be able to take this on, apply it to themselves, and then behave differently, I think, is quite challenging. And I think actually talking to Michael Paymar, he would say the same thing now, that actually it's probably not enough to tell people, here are the roots of the problem, that you need to help people actually change, enact that change.
Edward.
Yeah, I'm very interested to address the issues related to in-law conflict, and especially that could be representing the extended family's influence on the IPV. So the reason why I mentioned this is because I did have some studies in Hong Kong and in Chinese families that the relationship between the so-called the couple and nuclear family is quite close with the extended family. So basically, on the positive end, the in-laws, the grandparents, they are available to help take care of the grandchildren. But on the negative side, they're too close and it could be intrusive to that family. So this I would consider could be quite a kind of a dimension reflecting the culture issues, because basically the in-laws is bringing in the family culture, traditions, and then always that could be quite abusive to the women. So when I learned about this, because on the contrary, when I compare the in-law relationship in the United States, of course they have in-law, and in-law conflict is something very common, but because they are living apart, so probably the in-laws are in another state or whatever, so it doesn't really affecting daily living arrangement. So in your context, how would you describe that the extended family, especially those in-laws, are they close to the nuclear family? And how would you describe that? Do you consider this could be better?
There are many answers to that one. But one thing, I suppose, if we talk within the indigenous populations, there are three examples I think I'd like to briefly talk about. We have an experience that actually the people who move in Britain are the higher social classes who have access to money. That many of the people who earn less money actually live very close to their families. They live and die within 3 miles of where they were born. So whilst they don't live within the extended family is likely to be quite close. So it's quite different from the US. It's not quite the same as Asian culture, but actually bear in mind that we also have a number of different cultures. So for some, certainly our minority ethnic women, they would definitely be likely to be living within extended families. There's also, if I give an example, I actually did an assessment with a woman who had experienced a high level of domestic abuse from a medic, so a very highly respected consultant. They, in fact, had been living within their families' larger accommodations. So they lived in a huge basement apartment, but in part of the culture. This was a very middle-class woman who, after I think about 8 years of abuse and 4 children, was finally able to go to court and come to see me to do an assessment. And she was saying that, her partner used to force her to engage in sex and drink and things. She would be beaten. She would be trying to escape from the basement apartment to her in-laws' house, and they would be saying, it's only when he's been drinking. You're privileged, you live in a beautiful place, what are you doing? So there was a similar amount, of actual collusion, even within families where that wouldn't have been expected. And then the final point, another woman I did years and years ago, I was doing some work with in terms of assessments for court, in terms of child protection. And she was saying that, she had 7 children, I think it was, and she'd been with her partner for 8 years, and she had experienced extreme high levels of abuse and had gone to shelters and come back and shelters and come back. And she was explaining to me that her mother was saying, but he's the father of your children, and came out with the phrase, you made your bed, lie on it. So, he's the father of your children, you should go back. They didn't live together, but there was equal amount of collusion in terms of with the perpetrator. Now, it turns out that the children were, in fact, all of them the result of rape. So she was, in a number of different ways, living with the consequences of abuse, and her family was saying, well, he's the father of your children, go back. So I think there are differences in terms of the living arrangements and how closely people see that culture is coming forward. But actually, even at a distance and with different family relations, it's equally problematic, or could be equally positive or problematic.
Thank you. Right, we're going to push on, and we will have time for extended discussion later this morning. So I'll be following very closely, actually, from Professor Gilchrist's presentation, and I'm really pleased to be following her because she's helpfully sort of mapped out some of the more sort of theoretical aspects that I'll be providing some practical examples or narratives with respect to. So hopefully you'll see that there's a great deal of resonance across the two presentations, and hopefully it'll help concretize some of our discussions this morning. So I want to focus on what it means in terms of your entitlements to certain services in society when you have a victimized status, or even when you're a perpetrator, although my work for now is focused primarily on victims. And I'm trying to understand sort of the qualitative experiences and help-seeking patterns among ethnic minority and immigrant victims. And for the purposes of the study that I conducted, I looked at Hong Kong and the UK, mainly the cities really, so Greater London area and Hong Kong, to provide sort of a comparative perspective, because we share such similar legal systems, but also our framework of governance and policy is largely drawn from the way in which the structure is set up in the United Kingdom. The analysis I've tried to frame in terms of the Hong Kong government's obligations under the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so it's a CEDAW framework, and its obligations to deliver on equal protection under the law to all people, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, and other minority status, but also going back to something that Professor Gilchrist said, that it's not just about culture, but it's the broader framework of factors that are enablers or disenablers in terms of access. So the findings reveal an institutional level of incompetence or systemic failures and certain sort of inadequacies which result in particular groups of women falling through what I'm calling the justice gap. I seek to ground the recommendations that stem from this research in the context of human rights because of the reasons I've just mentioned. When you have a systemic failure and you look at international obligations and the laws that we have, it's important to sort of frame the analysis to pinpoint whose responsibility is it then to fix part of the problem. Because when you locate responsibility, you then start having resource allocation and then the requisite training and mapping out the necessary interventions. So to some extent, there is an important aspect to sort of framing it in this way. Not only are states required to protect the rights of all women and all persons within their jurisdictions, but to do so equally and equally effectively. So in that sense, there's an obligation of due diligence to ensure that not just individual circumstances of violence are subject to criminal laws, but also violence perpetrated in the private sphere is also brought to justice under appropriate laws. And so, of course, we all recognize that domestic violence is different from the violence that you encounter at the hands of strangers. And because of the intimate context, you struggle with how to deal with that violence. And, of course, we understand that we shun the role and relevance of the law when it comes to the personal sphere for a number of reasons, as we'll see, but particularly some of the factors that Professor Gilchrist touched on in terms of immigration, the children, in-laws, and your wider culture or community of people who you feel accountable to will also dissuade you from dealing with your issue of violence in a particular manner. But it is important to take a systematic lens so that you can address the barriers that are converging to make certain women even more vulnerable than the ordinary women in Hong Kong who might be at risk of violence. And the figures in Hong Kong are quite reflective of the global figures of the problem. 1 in 3 women have, at some point or the other, experienced either sexual or domestic violence at the hands of a person that they know. So it's not stranger-based violence, it's mostly people that we know. So in terms of framing it within the context of the CEDAW Convention, the articles focus on achieving equality and non-discrimination for women in all spheres of life, and the argument is that without freedom from violence, you're not able to enjoy access to any of these other rights, whether it's education, legal rights, rights to personality, or reproductive rights and autonomy. And that is the reason why you do have to focus on equal access. Article 5 of CEDAW singles out the impact of all cultural factors, particularly patriarchy, as an equality barrier in the systemic sense to women's enjoyment of human rights equally. Feminist critique of institutional cultures, particularly of institutions such as the law, is that the law is inherently masculine. So even the framing of the law makes certain assumptions about individuals that are masculine in nature. And that also affects how effective these provisions are to help women. So for example, we make various assumptions about victims and their accessibility to frameworks for protection, which I'll talk about in a moment. I also want to highlight the Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which was enacted in 1993. It's not a convention, but it really effectively sort of lays out the duty that is on state parties under Article 4, which says that states must not only condemn violence by exercising due diligence in their implementation of an adequate framework to prevent, protect, prosecute, punish, and provide reparations for victims in the public and private sphere, but they must also develop comprehensive strategies to address violence at all levels, including in the legal aspects. So courts need to do what they do properly, but also politically and administratively and culturally, measures need to be in place to ensure that violence at all levels is duly addressed. And particularly, the provision singles out the need to guard against re-victimization of victims because of these failures. Intersections theory has called into question the one-size-fits-all approach, which underscores the protective framework of most countries and, Hong Kong and UK not to be singled out in that respect. We too have a generic one-size-fits-all approach for the most part, but the application of an intersectional analysis to the experience of victims of domestic violence promptly reveals that not all women are in the position to access these mechanisms, and the effectiveness of the measures depend predominantly on individual user capacities, but also what I call internal factors, which might be culture, religion, and value frameworks, but also external factors such as financial dependence on the abuser, a lack of employment status, a lack of social mobility in a city, for example. So many of the women would not have phones or might not know how to take transport to areas of service. So factors which I'm calling external factors, such as immigration, financial, and other barriers that impact their social competence to receptivity or accessibility to help measures. So failure to account for these renders this group of people particularly vulnerable to becoming entrenched in a situation of violence. So it's not just one-off experiences of violence, but how you become stuck in a cycle of violence, and that affects what you choose to, what you think you can do about it going forward. So understanding the lived realities and experiences at each occasion of violence and how all of these factors actually grip the woman's sort of experience to impact what she's going to do next is really, really important to understand that and then devise appropriate interventions accordingly. So the research basically sought to look at the lived experiences by drawing on women's narratives and to identify prevalent measures and interventions at the moment, and then to see what kind of transformative justice recommendations can be made by focusing on the due diligence obligation of the state so that those of us in the field can have the tools and develop the tools necessary to implement a more effective regime of interventions. So we do need to challenge, as Professor Gilchrist said, our laws, our structures, our frameworks, and figure out how we can be better informed about doing this work. I'm not going to go too much in depth into the methodology, except to highlight that I'm going to be speaking about social workers that I interviewed, and also healthcare professionals, police from the UK, not from Hong Kong, and predominantly ethnic minority and immigrant women, both victims and non-victims. I was keen to compare what the perception and knowledge levels are between the victim group and the non-victim group across both countries. In terms of literature review, we know that various studies have highlighted the fact that individual capacities do impact victims' experiences and help-seeking behavior, but the role of ethnicity is limited in this broader picture, and this is what I've sought to sort of add to in terms of the literature, by identifying the specific personal barriers or competence-related capacities that we should be focusing on. So these are the assumptions I wanted to draw your attention to in terms of the existing framework. We think about anticipated or logical responses of women to domestic violence. So, for example, she's going to be able to recognize that what's happening to her is abusive behavior. But, for example, rape within marriage is not necessarily considered rape by all people because they feel there's an entitlement to sex on the part of the male partner as and whenever they want. And then that they'll be able to take the necessary steps to initiate a complaint and seek the assistance of police or social services or healthcare. But the idea is that essentially victims need to be recognized as responding to violence uniquely depending on their circumstances. So in terms of awareness of legal rights, I found that predominantly the women were under-aware of the fact that there were laws against, for example, their equal protection on grounds of race, but also on grounds of being a woman, so equality rights. They were also unaware of the fact that domestic violence was a crime at the time of the abuse, and their level of knowledge regarding laws in general and the system was quite poor. But comparatively, the UK victims seem to be doing better than the Hong Kong counterparts. You can see from the statements the kinds of worries that impact women's decisions are, for example, she didn't want to call the police because she wasn't sure if she'd acted in self-defense and inflicted harm on the perpetrator, then she thought she would be subject to an arrest as well. And another woman had the same fear, felt that she couldn't leave her children behind. So what would happen? The uncertainty made her less sure that this is the step she wanted to take. And then, of course, the immigration barrier. So even though she knew it was wrong, she was worried about her visa status, and she didn't know if that would land her in trouble or being separated from her children. Perceptions of law and authority, the level of satisfaction that the women had towards the legal system. Again, these are scores out of 5, so we're not doing terribly well. But you can see that in Hong Kong, the victim group is less satisfied than the non-victim groups in terms of the rights of the innocent and the ability of the system to help determine the guilt of the accused. In the UK, you can see that there's a very low level of confidence in terms of underrepresented litigants. But on the whole, in the UK, the experience seems to be that the victims have greater satisfaction levels and better perceptions of law and authority compared to the non-victims. This is important because it means that if people who've not been victimized yet have a perception that they're not going to be dealt with the system effectively, then this would impact their access to the system and the likelihood that they would seek assistance in the first place. I just want to highlight that a lot of the sample for this particular question was drawn from the mainland Chinese women, and that might impact their vision of the Hong Kong legal system and how satisfied they were. Perhaps they're comparing it to what they see in terms of rule of law back home, so that's important to bear in mind. On the police satisfaction levels, again, you can see a similar pattern. There's a greater confidence and satisfaction with police protection on the part of victims in the UK compared to non-victims. You can see, in fact, it's quite stark. So 5 out of 5 for treating women, everyone fairly, but then the non-victims scored the police very poorly on treatment in terms of fairness. Whereas in Hong Kong, we see a similar pattern again, but the scores are much lower this time. The overall level of confidence, again, the victims are more confident than the non-victims, so lessons to be taken from there. Immigration status as a barrier. the no recourse to public funds rules, which Professor Gilchrist spoke about earlier, is important. So it sort of stands in the way of whether you can seek help, even if you do ask for assistance. Of course, you can call the police, but you won't get any access to shelters or particular resources. In Hong Kong, the majority of the victims chose to wait the 7-year period, which is the lead time required for concretizing your immigration status, before even complaining for the first time. So one of the women interviewed waited 6.5 years before she said anything to anybody here. But just also by way of comparison, she waited 15 years before telling her parents back home that she was now a divorced woman living alone in Hong Kong with her children. So that's the level of shame or resistance that might be brought on in terms of facing this experience, despite it being not her fault, but culturally to have that as a barrier. There's also the domestic violence concession rule in the context of the UK, where you can raise that, but again, there's evidentiary burdens, as Professor Gilchrist mentioned. In Hong Kong, we have no such equivalent. So women's visa status will not necessarily be considered independently of the abuser's sponsorship, even if she shows that she's a victim of domestic violence. And the problem there, of course, is that because they depend on the abusers financially and in so many other ways, their fear primarily is that of their children being taken away from them. And so they choose their own sort of comfort versus their comfort of the children. And this tension between their own protection of themselves and then their child is constantly grating against them in terms of what they're going to do next. Substance abuse was found to be a problem for some of the participant sample in my group, but many of them found that there was no systematic approach to dealing with substance abuse as part of the framework in which violence was experienced. Some women complained that alcohol was often cited as an excuse by the husband. He was very apologetic, claimed no memory of what happened, expressed shock that he could be so brutal, and said, "I'm sorry, it won't happen again," only for it to recur several times over. And of